Welcome to News from Neptune for November 8th in the 45th week of 2019. I'm Carl Estabrook. The socialist Rosa Luxemburg, who was murdered by a self-proclaimed socialist government in the aftermath of World War I, said the most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening. Remarkably enough, we seem to be verging on a discussion in this country of what the term socialist means. It's not easy, owing to generations of U.S. propaganda. Noam Chomsky, who inspires our program, says terms like capitalism and socialism have been so evacuated of meaning that I don't like to use them. There's nothing remotely like capitalism in Karl Marx's sense in existence. To the extent there ever was, it disappeared by the 1920s. Every industrial society today is one form or another of state capitalism. That doesn't deny that state socialist regime, let's try that again. That doesn't deny that state capitalist regimes who called themselves socialist made immense strides in the 20th century, notably in Russia and China. Since 1990, News from Neptune has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Earlier editions of this program are available at archive.org. Chomsky says in the U.S. media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true and it will sound like it's from Neptune. David Green and I, with the help of J.B. Nicholson, will try to say some true things on a palace coup edition of News from Neptune. A palace coup refers to the overthrow of a government by senior officials within the ruling group, and one is clearly brewing in the United States today. Interesting to see which way it may go. Stephen Cohen, who has been writing sensible things for a good while, particularly in the publication edited by his wife, The Nation, has a column entitled Inconvenient Truths, Alarming Things We've Learned Under Trump, but not always about him. After almost daily for 3 years, Democrats and their media have told us very bad things about Donald Trump's life, character, and presidency. Some of them are true. But in the process, we've also learned some lamentable, even alarming things about the Democratic Party establishment, including self-professed liberals. Consider the following. 1. The Democratic establishment is deeply and widely imbued with rancid Russophobic attitudes. Most telling was, and remains, a core Russiagate allegation that, quote, Russia attacked American democracy during the 2016 presidential election on Trump's behalf. An attack so nefarious, it's often been equated with Pearl Harbor. I'm not making this up. You can find it amongst the liberal discussions of the matter. But there was no attack in 2016. Only, Cohen says, as he previously explained, ritualistic meddling of the kind that both Russia and America have undertaken in the other's elections for decades. Little can be more phobic than the allegation or belief that one has been attacked by a hostile entity. Yet this myth and its false narrative persist in the Democratic Party's discourse, campaigning, and fundraising. 2. We've also learned that the heads of America's intelligence agencies under President Obama, especially John Brennan of the CIA and James Clapper, Director of National Intelligence, felt themselves entitled to try to undermine an American presidential candidacy and subsequent presidency, that of Donald Trump. Early on, I termed this Operation Intelgate, and it has since been well documented by other writers, including Lee Smith in a new book. Intel officials did so in tacit alliance with certain leading and equally Russophobic members of the Democratic Party, which had once opposed such transgressions. This may be the most alarming revelation of the Trump years. Trump will leave power, but these self-aggrandizing intelligence agencies will remain. 3. We also learned that, contrary to Democratic dogma, the mainstream free press cannot be fully trusted to readily expose such abuses of power. Cohen's a master of understatement. Indeed, what the mainstream media, leading national newspapers and 2 cable news networks in particular, chose to cover and report, and chose not to cover and report, made the abuses and consequences of Russiagate allegations possible. Even now, exceedingly influential publications, such as the New York Times, seem eager to delegitimize the investigation by Attorney General William Barr and his appointed special investigator John Durham into the origins of Russiagate. Barr's critics accuse him of fabricating a conspiracy theory on behalf of Trump. But the real or grandest conspiracy theory was the Russiagate allegation of collusion between Trump and the Kremlin, an accusation that was, or should have been, discredited by the Robert Mueller report. For as we have learned, or should have learned, that for all the talk by Democrats about Trump as a danger to U.S. national security, it's their Russiagate allegations which truly endanger it. Consider 2 examples. Russia's new hypersonic missiles, which can elude U.S. missile defense systems, make new nuclear arms negotiations with Moscow imperative and urgent. If only for the sake of his legacy, Trump is likely to want to do so. But even if he's able to, will Trump be entrusted enough to conduct negotiations as successfully as did his predecessors in the White House, given the Putin puppet and Kremlin stooge accusations still being directed at him? Similarly, as I've asked repeatedly, if confronted with a U.S. Russian-Cuban missile-like crisis, anywhere Washington and Moscow are currently eyeball to eyeball militarily, from the Baltic region and Ukraine to Syria, will Trump be as free politically as was President John Kennedy to resolve it without war? Here, too, there's an inconvenient truth. To the extent that Democrats any longer seriously discuss national security in the context of U.S.-Russian relations, it mostly involves vilifying both Trump and Russian leader Vladimir Putin. Recall also that previous presidents were free to negotiate with Russia's Soviet communist leaders, even encouraged to do so, whereas the demonized Putin is an anti-communist, post-Soviet leader. The current state of U.S.-Russian relations is unprecedentedly dangerous, not only due to reasons cited here, a new Cold War fraught with the possibility of hot war. Whether President Trump serves 1 or 2 terms, he must be fully empowered to cope with the multiple possibilities of a U.S.-Russian military confrontation. That requires ridding him in our nation of Russiagate allegations, and that in turn requires learning how such allegations originated. Opponents of Barr's investigation into the origins of Russiagate say it's impermissible or unprecedented to, quote, investigate the investigators. But the bipartisan church committee, based in the U.S. Senate, did so in the mid-1970s. It exposed many abuses by U.S. intelligence agencies, particularly by the CIA, and adopted remedies that it believed would be permanent. Clearly, they have not been. However well-intentioned Barr may be, he's Trump's Attorney General, and therefore not fully credible. As I've also argued repeatedly, a new church committee is urgently needed. It's time for honorable members of the Senate of both parties to do their duty. That's the views of Ray McGovern on the situation in Washington at the moment. He makes the interesting assumption that there are honorable members of the Senate.
I was going to say, where are the, I hate to wax sentimental about the U.S. Senate, but where are the Frank Churches? Where are the William Fulbrights?
Well,
I know, but there was that, and that was all sort of in the context of anti-Nixonism, which perhaps was more merited than anti-Trumpism, or equally so. Anyway.
I've got another unfashionable comment on Trump for maybe a little later, and some other things, and some words on whistleblowers from our researcher Jeff Nicholson. But you have another line you want to follow.
Well,
right?
yeah. Well, first of all, let me at least say, let me comment that nobody seems to be wanting to respond to our recent controversial letters to the editor. yours regarding military veterans and mine regarding alleged gender harassment on campus. But so I wonder what's up with that. I wonder why people don't want to express themselves in ways that I know that they feel or think. But
Someone told me that the response to us is properly summarized as, "Okay, boomer."
okay, boomer.
Yeah, we can get into that maybe.
All right. All right. I'll be happy to be informed on whatever that means.
Rank ageism.
Yeah. Let me refer to some people, I think including Jeff Nicholson, have accused the Real News Network as having gone over to the Russophobic side. I'm not sure if that's quite true, but they certainly have dropped off. And the reason that Aaron Mate left the Real News, allegedly, is because he wasn't able to do the kind of anti-Russiagate journalism that he ended up doing on the Gray Zone, in which he publishes he does interviews under the rubric of pushback, and so I would refer to the series of very well done interviews that Paul Jay did with Stephen Cohen a year or so ago regarding Cohen's background, and I found them for anybody who hasn't watched those, I found those very, very informative.
And The Nation, which I grudgingly resubscribed to again and again after canceling my subscription regularly, does indeed include his discussions with a member of their staff each week.
Yeah. And I would also refer, as long as we're referring to Aaron Mate,
right.
He did a nice little interview, half-hour interview with his father, the well-known psychiatrist, Gabor Mate, whose story I did not know that well, and so I found it out from listening to this program. The interview was about Zionism, and the interview was about his relationship as a child born into Hungary, into Nazi-occupied Hungary at the end of World War II, and going forward from there, his relationship to Zionism and the Jewish state. And I can't say that in terms of the history of it, I didn't really learn anything that I didn't already know, but it was really good to hear the manner in which he put it in terms of his own life and his own growth.
That interview with the Mate's father and son will be run in Aware on the Air on
cool.
Tuesday, and links to it, to the interview, are on the Facebook pages for this program and Aware on the Air.
Yeah. So that said, the comments I want to make have to do with what I call what is the relationship between neoliberalism and immigration policy, especially as it has played out locally. In past episodes, I feel like I'm doing cliffhanger things. In past episodes, I've been critical of the manner in which the local group Bend the Ark, a Jewish group that claims to be progressive and pro-social justice and all that good stuff. I've been critical of the manner in which they have presented themselves publicly, namely as an adjunct to the Democratic Party, namely as people who don't really challenge the neoliberal pieties of our day. And this more or less continues with that, but I'm going from the Bend the Ark to a local group which does a program that is published on UPTV and YouTube, and that is also broadcast over at WRFU. That would be CU Immigration Forum, which is hosted by the person who is most responsible for the CU Immigration Forum, Thomas Garza, a local man who's been involved in this issue for several years or many years, and have been doing this program. They've got the number of programs they do is up to about 200, and I think they do one every other week. Maybe at some point they did one every week. I'm not sure. They recently had what they referred to as their yearly welcoming awards ceremony at the Urbana Free Library, in which one of the groups that got one of these awards was the aforementioned Ben the Ark. I'm going to be on the case of these people for various reasons, but most generally speaking, I think that we need to begin to understand whatever the horrible treatment that Donald Trump has meted out, that his administration has meted out to those crossing the border for the past 3 years, however awful the ICE behavior and the children in cages and all of that and all of the contractors. I'm not going to put that aside, but I'm going to also argue that the incessant criticism that Thomas Garza on his programs gives is pro-Democratic Party, anti-Trump, never critical. I've gone back and listened to programs before Trump was president in 2016, never critical of what the Obama administration's policies were for all of those 8 years in which Obama, as he always did with every issue, pretended to want to do something decent, but never really did it, for the most part. And I'm going to argue that at a somewhat trivial level, I'm going to argue that the CU Immigration Forum should stop pretending to be nonpartisan, because it's obviously Democratic Party. And when they do a program like what they did at the Urbana Free Library, sponsored not only by and actually not just getting a room and doing a program, which anybody can do, but actually being sponsored and supported by the Urbana Free Library, actually sponsored and being supported by the city of Urbana and the city of Champaign, that this crosses the line between political advocacy, between civic, that line, whatever that line is, between civic and political advocacy, and it's not appropriate. I understand that these welcoming awards ceremony is done in the name of humanitarianism. I realize it's done in the name of charitable activities of various kinds, but Thomas Garza and his and Ricardo Diaz, who also works with him on that and spoke at this event at the UFL, are clearly advocating for voters. And Thomas Garza has done this more than once. He'll say, I can't tell you who to vote for, but don't vote for Trump. That's, and I realize it's a somewhat trivial point, but I want to expose the idea that this is the Democratic Party speaking here, and it's the neoliberal wing of the Democratic Party. And I've spoken in a previous program on the relationship between local immigrant advocates and the business community. Like in that case, it was Doyle, what's his name, Matt Doyle, whoever, the Doyle of the Campus Y, who is working with the business community and so forth. And here's another one. I'm sort of getting to my main course here. Another article by Julie Wirth, who has a weekly spot on this program, in case you haven't noticed, Carl. This is from October 15th, 3 weeks ago. Area update, UI Dean, one of 50 to call on Trump for immigration policy changes. Quote, deans from 50 U.S. business schools have published an open letter to President Donald Trump and congressional leaders calling for changes to immigration policy and rhetoric. The signatories include Geese College of Business Dean Jeffrey Brown at the University of Illinois. The letter urges political leaders to remove per-country visa caps, modernize the visa processing system, and reform the H-1B visa program to make it possible for the most talented people to have a reasonable chance of gaining entry to the United States, end quote, of what that letter said. The H-1B visas allow employers to hire immigrants temporarily in specialty occupations. Critics say some foreign-based tech firms have used the visas to replace higher-paid U.S. workers. Critics not only say that, but it's actually true. The letter, sorry for the bad news. The letter, Worth goes on, the letter also recommends creating a quote-unquote heartland visa. This is what the Doyle thing was about a few weeks ago. One of the things the Doyle thing was about. Mike Doyle. A heartland visa to encourage talented immigrants to regions of this country that need them. The United States doesn't have the talent it needs in key fields or the capacity to train enough people with those skills to sustain U.S. economic growth over the next 30 years, the letter said. Hundreds of thousands of high-skilled immigrants are turned away each year because, quote, as this letter to Donald Trump by the business team said, quote, they failed to win the H-1B lottery. We are needlessly capping our growth and can do better, it said. Meanwhile, the number of foreign students at American business schools has declined for the past 3 years. Aren't you worried, Carl?
It breaks my heart.
Yeah, it's terrible. I don't know how we can live this way. Quote, again from the letter, the best and brightest from all around the world want to come here, and their hard work and expertise make our economy stronger and more globally competitive, end quote, the letter said. Quote again, yet a combination of our outdated laws, artificial regional and skills-based caps on immigration, and recent spikes in hostility, there you go, recent spikes in hostility, are closing the door to the high-skilled immigrants our economy needs to thrive.
Remember what it says in the base of the Statue of Liberty. Give me your talented people who can make money
well-educated,
who can make money for a U.S. corporation. Mm-hmm. Sure. I mean, it's been there from the beginning, right?
This is what I was referred to a few weeks ago when I talked about a related article from a statement issued by Mike Doyle working with the local business council. And again, it's this aspect of the heartland suffering, this called the heartland visa for these kind of Rust Belt areas or these dying Midwestern towns, that instead of having a national policy to revive these places through infrastructure expenditure, through a policy that, say a Green New Deal policy that could well, in various ways, help to revive some of these areas, just send people from foreign countries, and they wonder why these people resent Donald Trump. And similarly, on the other side of the coin, there's too many jobs. They claim there's too many jobs and not enough workers.
In some areas.
Yeah, in areas in which they allegedly claim to need high-tech skilled workers. I don't know what the data is, I haven't looked at that part of it, but they don't account for the fact that there's a lot of people in this country that could be trained for these jobs if indeed there aren't enough workers. Our good friend Dean Baker always says in these cases, if there aren't enough workers for these jobs, it would be indicated by the fact that wages are going up. And that has not been the case. Now, there may be nuanced analytical aspects, data statistical analytical aspects to that, which I don't understand, but I don't trust assertions like that. There's no reason to trust assertions like that. That's even setting aside the whole idea that this is an article from the Duke newspaper, the Duke University newspaper called The Chronicle, because it was the Duke dean, the dean of the Fuqua School of Business at Duke, who spurred this letter led the development of an open letter, and he says in this, this person whose name, a guy named Bolding, this article is titled, just in case, so Jeff can post this, Fuqua Dean spearheaded open letter to Trump. The letter emphasized the threats opposed to the American economy due to current administrative policies reducing the number of high-skilled immigrants entering the country. We do not believe the U.S. has the high-skilled talent it needs, nor does it have the capacity to train enough people with those skills, the letter explained. Without a substantial change in our approach, the deficit of skills will hinder economic growth. So there's a whole economic neoliberal can of worms that's opened up. Do we need economic growth, or do we need a better and more equal distribution of the economic outcomes that this extremely rich country has to offer, whether to citizens or to immigrants? All of these things we can talk about in neoliberal terms. We could talk about we could talk about the last 30 or 40 years, and especially the last 30 years of immigration policy in relation to NAFTA, in relation to free trade, other free trade agreements. We can talk about all that, but we shouldn't take them out of that context. And that's what the incessant prattling on of Thomas Garza and the CU Immigration Forum does. It simply says that there's a bunch of people out there that vote for Trump, that hate foreigners, and we should oppose them. And that's providing a front for neoliberal policies. I don't know how clear it can possibly be. He never raises any issues regarding what the economic context is, what the global context is, no less the military context, especially in relation to the Middle East, Latin America, and Central America, and so forth. So, this is on. I'm sick of it, Carl. These things have gone on long enough. People shouldn't be allowed to go and have this event at the Urbana Free Library as if it's just some goody two-shoes kind of thing. It's not.
Tell the truth and shame the devil, David.
Thank you.
That's important. You're listening to News from Neptune, where we try to do that, as David just did. We have another category to consider at the suggestion of our researcher, Jeff Nicholson, and that's the category of whistleblowers. You've heard a lot about whistleblowers, and we'll probably hear more in the next week or two. Jeff points out that if you're a whistleblower speaking in defense of power, like the CIA recently did, the unnamed whistleblower who is apparently a CIA agent and is blowing the whistle on Donald Trump. If you're a so-called whistleblower speaking in defense of power, you're a savvy official, a whistleblower, and Senator Chuck Schumer will defend the secrecy of your identity, but not if you whistleblow against power, which is the real meaning of whistleblowing in the first place. Consider what Caitlin Johnstone, whose interesting and provocative columns are worth reading. We put links to them frequently on the Facebook page for News from Neptune. Consider what Caitlin Johnstone told us recently on this issue. Even to call this spook, somebody got mad at me the other day on Facebook for using the word spook to refer to CIA agents. And they took it as a racial slur, which had nothing to do with what I was writing about, which is either older or they blocked me on Facebook for using the word.
You got to be so careful.
You do, but you also have to remember that spook was a long time derogatory name for CIA agents, and it's one we perhaps should recover. Jeff writes, even to call this spook a whistleblower, this is the one who has supposedly come forward to talk about Donald Trump's manners on the phone. Even to call the spook a whistleblower is ridiculous on its face. You don't get to call someone from the U.S. intelligence community a whistleblower unless they're actually whistleblowing on the U.S. intelligence community. That's not a thing. A CIA officer who exposes information about government officials is an operative performing an operation unless proven otherwise, because that's what the CIA does. It liberally leaks information wherever it's convenient for CIA agendas, while withholding all other information behind a veil of government secrecy. A CIA officer who exposes information about CIA wrongdoings without the CIA's permission is a whistleblower. A CIA officer who exposes information about someone else is just a spook doing spook things. You can recognize the latter by the way the mass media supports, applauds, and employs them. You can recognize the former by the way they've been persecuted, imprisoned, and or died under mysterious circumstances. She's referring to specific cases in each of those categories. Here's Senator Schumer, you remember him, on the Chucky.
Unfortunately.
Chucky, on the CIA operatives, sometimes referred to as a savvy official in the corporate media. Schumer says the calls to make public the whistleblower's identity are despicable. Whistleblowers should be protected, period. But when the subject was Edward Snowden, Schumer said, and each day that Snowden is allowed to roam free is another twist of the knife. As a damning report from the intelligence watchdog shows, that's the Intelligence Community Inspector General Office, the CIA and NSA win 189 out of 190 cases of whistleblower complaints. You can see the link on our Facebook page. The report, in fact, was shut down. The link comes from. The recommendable the report I'm quoting from adds examples from other real whistleblowers who were smeared. Former U.S. intelligence agent Richard Barlow, who blew the whistle on the U.S. selling banned nuclear technology to Pakistan. Former U.S. Marine Franz Geil, who blew the whistle about how to reduce U.S. troop lives lost in Iraq to improvise explosive devices with a swap of patrol vehicles used, and former U.S. State Department employee Peter Van Buren, who blew the whistle on State Department mismanagement and waste in Iraq, all were whistleblowing against the U.S. Government, what the government was doing. But instead we have this person, the CIA agent, donning the whistleblower mantle in order to continue the soft coup against Donald Trump. It is not a pretty picture. You're watching News from Neptune, and we have a few minutes left here.
We got 20,
yes,
25 minutes left.
Time flies when you're having fun.
Okay, well, there's just so many things. I guess there's a lot of debate, of course, about, I guess, the two issues that I've been most sort of listening about and doing a little bit of reading about have been Elizabeth Warren's alleged way of paying for Medicare for all, and the critiques that have been put forward on the podcast that I listen to that attempt to debunk both the nature of this program and the sincerity of it, and the manner in which Warren is sort of playing politics about that. And the primary one, as I've mentioned on previous weeks, is a podcast called What's Left with Benjamin Studebaker, and who is a Studebaker, as I hasten to add every week, and who has his own website and probably has some stuff up there that you could read about this. This particular podcast, which was just put out a couple days ago, is actually behind the Patreon paywall, but still, which I do subscribe to. So I think that they're right on target about every little thing that Warren is doing to tear down Bernie Sanders, to be a capitalist pretending to be slightly something else, and to be reinforcing this neoliberal wing of the Democratic Party. I think everything they say about that is basically true. The worst thing, I mentioned Dean Baker before, the worst thing he's ever done is his current article basically saying Warren is right on target with this funding program. And the kind of strange critique that Studebaker and his colleague are making about this is that Bernie Sanders is being honest in telling the middle class that their taxes are going to go up. But because it's going to be a cheaper, because you're going to cut costs by not having health insurance the way it is, by not having pharmaceuticals the way they are, and so on, that the overall family costs will go down. But he's being honest about it. And one of the charges they're making at Warren is that she is playing a very strange game by getting money from rich people while telling them that they're gonna provide all the taxes for paying for Medicare for all. And I know it's a little bit of a complicated argument, but I think that they're on the right track in seeing what's going on here.
I think that's true too. On the matter of whistleblowers, the Real News Network, which David mentioned a moment ago as having some identity problems, perhaps.
It's a common affliction these days.
Exactly. I mean, if we take a proper identity politics approach to the troubles of the Real News Network, then that's the way we think about it. But the concerns that about whistleblowers, and particularly some major real whistleblowers, Julian Assange and Manning, they have done good work in that regard. Both of them are prisoners of conscience recognized as such by, who aren't recognized as such by Amnesty International, but are undoubtedly prisoners of conscience of the first order, and the Real News Network says so. The network has bad politics on Russiagate. That's what we've been referring to in our critical moments here.
I guess I didn't realize they were so bad because I kind of stopped watching it.
Well, so
but not
did I.
necessarily
That's right.
because of that. But okay,
They were. That was the reason that Aaron Mate, whose work in this area we praised a moment ago, finally left.
And
the
Ben
Real News
Norton,
Network.
I assume Ben Norton
exactly,
as well.
Right. And it's a spreading disease. It's clearly has affected democracy now, for example, at
Absolutely.
the same time. But the Real News Network, to say something in their favor,
Yes.
they ran a recent story about John Pilger talking about Assange and whistleblowing. John Pilger is an Australian journalist and filmmaker who has done remarkable work in recent years, and so, of course, you probably haven't heard about him through the American media, but people who follow the international discussion of these matters are very much aware of Pilger's films and his interviews. The interview with John Pilger went like this. The interviewer says, Julian Assange recently lost a court bid to have his upcoming February 2020 extradition hearing postponed. The hearing about the postponement took place on October 21st. This is in London. And according to observers who were present, Assange could barely speak in coherent sentences as a result of his sufferings in prison. Reacting to the hearing, UN Human Rights Rapporteur Niels Meltzer warned last Friday that Assange continues to show symptoms of psychological torture. Meltzer had visited Assange in May when he conducted an extensive review of his physical and psychological condition. In his statement a week ago Friday, Meltzer says, quote, despite the medical urgency of my first appeal and the seriousness of the alleged violations, the UK has not undertaken any measures of investigation, prevention, and redress required under international law. This is the UN. In addition to the concerns about Assange's treatment at Belmarsh Prison outside of London, this is a maximum security prison. I assume they expect computer operators to arrive in force to liberate Julian Assange. Many have also raised concerns about the impartiality of the proceedings against him. That's putting it very mildly. Assange was jailed last April when the Ecuadorian embassy, where he'd been given political asylum, allowed the police to arrest him. The Ecuadorian government has done very well out of the deal, apparently. He then received a 50-week sentence. Assange received a 50-week sentence for having skipped jail in 2012. The Trump administration has since then requested Assange extradition on 17 charges of espionage, for which he could receive a 170-year prison sentence in the United States. Joining this program to discuss the latest development is John Pilger. He's been observing the Assange case very closely and was present at the October 24th court hearing, award-winning journalist and documentary filmmaker. His most recent film, by the way, which you probably haven't seen, it takes some effort, is called The Coming War on China, and says something about the U.S.-Chinese relations that's very much worth saying. Pilger says, I was at the last hearing and I saw Julian about a week before that, so I've seen him up close on a number of occasions recently. I think I can agree with the UN rapporteur's assessment. It's very difficult to tell. His physical condition has changed dramatically. He's lost about 15 kilos in weight. The guy's an Australian. To see him in court struggling to say his name and his date of birth was really very moving. I've seen that when I visited Julian in Belmarsh Prison, where he struggles at first and then collects himself. I've always impressed by the sheer resilience of the man because, as the UN rapporteur says, absolutely nothing has been done to change the conditions imposed on him by the prison regime. Nothing has been done by the British authorities. This was almost underlined by the contemptuous way that this court hearing recently was conducted by the judge, by this magistrate. There was a sense among all of us who were there that the whole charade, and it seemed a charade, was preordained. You had sitting in front of us on a long table 4 Americans who were from the U.S. Embassy here in London, and one of the prosecution team was scurrying backwards and forwards to get instructions from them. Now remember, this is the British government of Boris Johnson, and the Johnson government has other reasons for even more reasons than most British governments do to suck up to the United States. The judge could see this, and she allowed it. That is, the fact the Americans were directing the operation. It was absolutely outrageous, says Pilger. When Julian did try to speak and to say that basically he was being denied the very tools with which to prepare his case, he was denied the right to call his American lawyer. He was denied the right to have any kind of word processor or a laptop. He was denied certain documents. As he said, I'm even denied my own writings. That is, his own notes and manuscripts and his published writings. This hasn't changed at all. And of course, the effect on his morale, to say the least, has been very significant, and it showed in court. Craig Murray, who is also a blogger and an important one, was also at the hearing, and he wrote about a number of the issues which Pilger also mentioned. He specifically mentions that the district judge, whose name is Beretzer, and one of the things she did was completely dismiss Assange's request for determination whether the extradition proceedings were even legal. That is, he cites, according to UK law, quote, extradition shall not be granted if the offense for which extradition is requested is a political offense, close quote. Now, what do we think of this? I mean, what Julian Assange has done is about as clearly a political offense as any could be. Pilger goes on to discuss his his observations of the trial and his connection with Assange's lawyer and what a kangaroo court this British operation is. A lot of things involved here, including the peculiar precarious position of the British government, but it results in one of the most remarkable interventions and reportage that the American government has been responsible for a long time. The American plea is is based in part on the Espionage Act filed by produced by the Wilson administration, the First World War, in order to suppress anti-war statements, anti-war activities in the U.S. in regard to World War I. The act has been used since then for that very purpose, and it was the presidency of Barack Obama that used the act more than any administration, indeed more than all the administrations from the First World War to the present, in order to suppress reportage, in order to suppress accounts of war and opposition statements to the war. So modern administrations, Obama's and Trump's, have shown the way, and the result is an amazing suppression of free speech and reporting on the part of the U.S. in the case of Julian Assange. And we have no less an authority than John Pilger to give us an account of that, and to its credit, the Real News Network for bringing it to us.
Yeah, and the Real News Network, this journalist, this interviewer, Greg Wilpert, is one of the founders of the website Venezuela Analysis, and his stories are usually worth watching. Also, the Real News Network has continued on with its Baltimore bureau, which does a lot of real good local journalism. You know, I mean, Baltimore is a specific case of this, but the same thing goes on in most major cities in this country in terms of gentrification and sweetheart deals and all that kind of stuff. And they do a good job with their Baltimore bureau. A reporter named Stephen Janis who does that. And on a lighter note, Carl, did you notice the article about the death of the local jurist Harold Jensen?
I did see the article.
In which Mary Schenck, the intrepid courtroom reporter of the News Gazette, actually had the shamelessness to write that Harold Jensen had gone to receive his final verdict.
I suppose.
I mean, she wrote that. They published it. I couldn't quite believe it, but you know.
The News Gazette.
May he rest in peace.
The News Gazette, which has recently declared bankruptcy, may have reasons to want to laugh, huh?
Yeah. But yeah. Well, I think you might have known Harold, right?
I met him.
Okay. Well, that's good enough for me. I'm sure you know.
We old folks hang together, eh?
Yeah.
On the whistleblower line, one of the most notable ones, of course, is Edward Snowden, who exposed what the NSA was doing.
Yeah.
Snowden recently asked, "What do you do when the most powerful institutions in society have become the least accountable to society?" I think that's a question our generation exists to answer. Well, I hope he's right, but I don't know. There's our own investigator, Jeff Nicholson, says, I think there's, in regard to technology, I think there's a lot of education needed to properly answer this question, because it was the technology, after all, that underlay Snowden's ability to tell us what was going on. But the public still doesn't understand software freedom, because they've never been taught to know what software freedom is. It's the freedom to run, inspect, share, and modify published computer software. And we see how important that those questions have been in recent major issues, including the Russiagate nonsense. Snowden makes a number of great points in his talk. One of them is, quote, the General Data Protection Regulation aimed to increase privacy and respect people's ability to get data from firms regarding what the firm knows about that individual. This was a British approach to dealing with this problem. It misplaces the problem. The problem isn't data protection. The problem is data collection. Regulating the protection of data presumes that the collection of data in the first place was proper, that it was appropriate, and it doesn't present a threat or danger, that it's okay to spy on everybody all the time, whether you're customers or whether you're citizens, so long as it never leaks. Leaks is not the problem. Leaks are not the problem, according to Jeff, and quoting Snowden. Snowden's words are comparable with what other insightful people have said about the danger of unlimited data collection. Notably the author Richard Stallman, who's long objected to Facebook. And the arguments about Facebook in this country right now have much more to do with the question of whose politics are being promoted by Facebook, not the question of the more fundamental question about the collection of data by organizations like Facebook. And this is a growing issue. It's proper to make Facebook keep its promises on the collection of data, but this does not go far enough to make Facebook acceptable to use. It does not limit Facebook's data collection. For instance, it doesn't stop Facebook from collecting data about browsing through a like button. It only limits what Facebook can do with that data, and certainly does not stop Facebook from handing it over to Big Brother under the U.S. Stop the Riot Act. This is a technical question and a political one as well that has becoming increasingly important in this country. We will hear more about this issue as the arguments about Facebook and so forth go on. It may be a massive exercise in missing the point. The point is the sort of surveillance that Snowden revealed and is indeed on the run for.
So let me mention two notorious dead people. One is Jeffrey Epstein, and the other is John Demjanjuk. I wrote an article criticizing a column that Nicholas Kristof wrote about Jeffrey Epstein a few weeks ago, and I got exactly one email response regarding that from a fellow named David Rosen, who writes for Counterpunch. He has published a book called Sin, Sex, and Subversion, which talks about the sordid relationships, political relationships that go with that topic. But he also has a column today on Counterpunch. I was looking at it, I thought maybe he would refer to me, but he didn't. But that's just my narcissism, my pathological narcissism coming out again. But he did write a nice column questioning whether we've heard the last of how Jeffrey Epstein died. We have to do a little conspiracy corner every week here on News from Neptune, and so I recommend that article to you, just as continuing to wonder why it is that so little is being said about Jeffrey
question.
Epstein died.
It is quite remarkable. Yeah. I mean, the circumstances. Here's this man supposedly in the custody of the American prison system, and someone pretty clearly managed to get into his cell, strangle him to death, and get away without the authorities noticing anything but the possibility that Epstein hanged himself. Pretty clearly he didn't. Yeah. And pretty clearly he was murdered by people who didn't want him to talk. Who are these people? How did it happen? And why aren't the crack investigative reporters of the U.S. working on the issue?
We'll return to this whenever we possibly can. And let me also, in relationship to John Demjanjuk, who was for many years known as Ivan the Terrible, but turned out not to be Ivan the Terrible, but still continued to be, I guess I would say, hounded by the U.S. government, the Attorney General's office. Let me just read, as I've never read from my phone before on this program, so let me give it a try.
You should say who this is. I'm not sure everyone is down with...
John Demjanjuk was a Ukrainian who came to this country and was identified by Israel as being a concentration camp perpetrator, and ended up spending the last 30 years of his life in and out of custody for various reasons, until finally he was sent to Germany and died there a few years ago. And let me just, the reason I'm bringing this up is, I had written an article about him on Counterpunch in 2009, and I would like to return to that at some point. But let me just say, the reason I'm reading this, Jeffrey St. Clair writes this morning on Counterpunch, I highly recommend the Netflix documentary The Devil Next Door on the Demyanjuk case. It has a bit of everything: Ukrainian Nazis, possible Russian-Soviet meddling, forgeries, nationalism, prosecutors who destroy exculpatory evidence, the fallibility of eyewitness testimony, even from Holocaust survivors, and the U.S. embrace of quote-unquote former Nazis as long as they were anti-communist. It was so compelling that I watched all 5 episodes in one sitting. Ironically, I happened to be reading Philip Roth's Operation Shylock, a faux memoir where Roth encounters another Philip Roth, quote-unquote, in Jerusalem while covering the Demyanjuk trial, who is advocating the repatriation of Jews from Israel to Europe. The novel was published before the resolution of the case, which, as the documentary shows, remains ambiguous but gets at the essence. There were 2 Demyanjuks, St. Clair writes, one who was Ivan the Terrible only in the eyes of Treblinka, that's concentration camp survivors, and the other who wasn't at Treblinka but was killing Jews at Sobibor, another concentration camp. So I'll look forward to watching that, actually. Even though I don't usually watch Netflix programs, this sounds like one that's more or less in my wheelhouse, but lots more to say about that in terms of the way the whole concentration camp issue, the whole Nazi issue was handled by something called the Office of Special Investigations in this country, and this gets back to Norman Finkelstein, the Holocaust industry, and all that.
You've been watching News from Neptune for the 45th week of 2019, a Palace Coup edition. New evidence of Rodney Reed's innocence keeps emergent. The state of Texas wants to kill him next week. He's still on death row. Share this information with Texans who can contact the governor, the Texas governor, who could commute this man who seems to have been wrongly convicted. A link on the Facebook page for News from Neptune. News from Neptune is presented by Carl Estabrook, David Green, and J.B. Nicholson. It's produced and directed by Jason Liggett. See the research notes on the Facebook page from J.B. Nicholson. Veterans Day is Tuesday, November 11th. Those attending to the News Gazette's feature, Those Who Served, should recall the remark by the late George Carlin that service is a funny name for killing people.
It's actually Monday.
Is it Monday?
Yeah.
Oh. All right.
That's okay, though.
I lost another day this week.
No big deal.
Since 1945, the United States government has killed over 20 million people in wars, Korea, Vietnam, the Middle East, Latin America, and elsewhere, designed to maintain the worldwide economic hegemony that the U.S. inherited as the only largely undamaged major country in World War II. Russia lost some 27 million people in defeating Nazism. The U.S. lost 500,000 in World War II as a whole. On Armistice Day, and maybe whether it's Monday or Tuesday, both days worthwhile to remember that the people we are honoring and so forth may have been courageous. They may also have been fighting in wrong causes, and we should be talking about it, not simply celebrating. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune. To remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere in The Tempest, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.